The winter Eliza's father died, the world turned cold in more ways than one. She was only 12 years old when pneumonia claimed him, leaving her in the care of Margaret, the woman he'd married just 8 months prior. Eliza remembered how her father had smiled when he introduced Margaret, how he believed he was giving his daughter a new mother to love her. But the moment the funeral flowers wilted, so too did Margaret's pretense of kindness. The warmth drained from her stepmother's eyes like water through a sieve, replaced by something hard and calculating. The large farmhouse that had once echoed with Eliza's laughter became a prison of chores and criticism. Margaret's 2 daughters, Constance and Beatrice, were pampered and praised while Eliza was relegated to the role of servant. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, washed dishes until her hands cracked and bled, and mended clothes by candlelight long after the others had retired to their warm beds. Margaret found fault in everything Eliza did, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You've burned the porridge again, you useless girl," she would shriek, though the porridge was perfect. "You've torn Beatrice's dress," she would accuse, though it was Beatrice's own carelessness that caused the damage. Eliza endured it all with quiet dignity, clinging to memories of her father's gentle voice and kind eyes. She would stand at her bedroom window, gazing out at the old barn where her father's horses once lived, and remember happier times. But even that small comfort was soon to be stolen from her, for Margaret's cruelty knew no bounds, and winter was deepening its grip on the land. The transgression that sealed Eliza's fate was nothing more than an accident, though Margaret treated it as high treason. Constance had demanded that Eliza style her hair for the harvest dance, pulling and tugging at the girl's arms until Eliza reluctantly agreed. But Constance's hair was thick and unruly, and in her haste, Eliza had pulled too hard on a particularly stubborn tangle. Constance shrieked as though mortally wounded, and within moments, Margaret stormed into the room like an avenging fury. "You dare to hurt my daughter?" Margaret's hand connected with Eliza's cheek with a crack that echoed through the house. Stars exploded behind Eliza's eyes as she stumbled backward, tasting blood. "I won't have you under my roof another moment. You're an ungrateful, vicious child, and I know exactly where creatures like you belong." Before Eliza could protest or apologize, Margaret grabbed her roughly by the arm, her fingers digging in like talons, and dragged her down the stairs. Beatrice watched from the landing with a satisfied smirk while Constance continued her theatrical sobbing. The autumn evening had turned bitter cold, and Eliza had only her thin cotton dress to protect her. Margaret hauled her across the yard toward the old barn, a structure that hadn't housed animals in years and had fallen into disrepair. The door groaned on rusty hinges as Margaret thrust Eliza inside. "You'll stay here until you've learned some gratitude," Margaret hissed, her face twisted with malice. "Perhaps a few days in the cold will teach you to appreciate the generosity I've shown you." The heavy wooden beam fell into place across the door with a terrible finality. Eliza heard her stepmother's footsteps retreating, and then there was only silence and the gathering darkness. Eliza's eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom of the barn, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. The structure was larger than she remembered from childhood visits with her father, with a high ceiling crossed by ancient beams and walls lined with empty stalls. Hay mouldered in forgotten corners, and the air smelled of dust and decay. She sank down onto a pile of relatively clean straw, fighting back tears. Crying wouldn't help her now. She needed to think, to find a way to survive until Margaret's anger cooled enough to release her. But as the darkness deepened, Eliza became aware that she wasn't alone. At first, it was just a rustling in the far corner, then the soft hoot of an owl from the rafters above. A pair of luminous eyes appeared in the darkness, then another, and another. Eliza's heart hammered with fear until a gentle nose pushed against her hand. She gasped and looked down to find a skeletal dog, its ribs showing through matted fur, gazing up at her with sorrowful brown eyes. "Oh, you poor thing," Eliza whispered, running her hand over the dog's head. The animal leaned into her touch, as though starving for affection. More animals emerged from the shadows, a three-legged cat that limped toward her, purring, a goat with a scarred face and one broken horn, rabbits with torn ears, and even a young deer with a wounded leg. These were the forgotten ones, the animals that had been abandoned, injured, or escaped from cruel treatment. They had found refuge in this barn, surviving as best they could, and now they gathered around Eliza as though recognizing a kindred spirit. The owl swooped down from the rafters and perched on a nearby post, its golden eyes wise and ancient. Despite her fear and cold, Eliza felt a strange comfort in their presence. As the temperature dropped and frost began to form on the barn's windows, Eliza's shivering became uncontrollable. Her thin dress provided almost no protection against the November cold, and she could see her breath forming clouds in the air. She curled into a tight ball in the straw, trying to conserve what little warmth her body could generate, but it wasn't enough. Hypothermia was a real danger, and she knew that Margaret might very well leave her here long enough for the cold to do its deadly work. She thought about calling out, begging for mercy, but pride and the certainty that no mercy would come kept her silent. Just when Eliza felt she might freeze to death, something remarkable happened. The dog she had petted earlier approached and lay down against her back, pressing its warm body against hers. Then the goat settled in front of her, creating a windbreak with its bulk. The three-legged cat curled up in the hollow of her lap, its purr vibrating like a tiny motor. One by one, the rabbits hopped closer, nestling into the spaces around her, their soft fur adding layers of insulation. Even the deer, despite its wounded leg, carefully positioned itself nearby, adding its body heat to the collective warmth. The animals had chosen to share their warmth with her, these creatures who had every reason to hate humans for the cruelty they'd endured. Tears finally came then, sliding down Eliza's cheeks, not tears of despair but of gratitude and wonder. She stroked the cat's head and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you all." The owl hooted softly from above, as if keeping watch over them all. Surrounded by her unlikely protectors, Eliza finally slept, her body warming in the embrace of mercy when the world had shown her only hate. Morning light filtered through gaps in the barn walls, waking Eliza to find herself still surrounded by her animal companions. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she was alive and relatively warm. As she sat up carefully, trying not to disturb the sleeping animals, she began to really look at them and notice the signs of their suffering. The dog's matted fur couldn't hide the scars that crisscrossed its body, marks of beatings, she realized with horror. The three-legged cat was missing its front right leg, the old wound suggesting a trap or perhaps a deliberately cruel act. The goat's broken horn had jagged edges, as though it had been torn rather than naturally broken, and its scarred face spoke of fire. Each animal bore the evidence of human cruelty, abandonment, or neglect. Yet these same creatures had chosen to save her life in the night, offering warmth and comfort when they could have simply ignored her plight. Eliza spent the morning gently examining each animal, her heart breaking at the stories their bodies told. The young deer had been shot, the arrow wound poorly healed, and likely the reason it had been separated from its mother and herd. The rabbits had torn ears from being kept in wire cages too small for their bodies. Even the owl, when it descended to accept a gentle scratch, revealed a wing that had been broken and healed crookedly, limiting its flight. "Who did this to you?" Eliza whispered, though she already knew the answer. People. People like Margaret, who saw creatures, whether animal or human, as things to be used and discarded. As if understanding her thoughts, the dog placed its head in her lap, and Eliza made a silent vow. If she survived this ordeal, she would never forget this lesson about mercy and compassion. By the second day, hunger had become Eliza's constant companion, a gnawing emptiness that made her head swim and her hands tremble. She searched the barn desperately for anything edible, finding only a few withered apples in a forgotten barrel and some grain that had scattered from a broken sack. It wasn't much, barely enough for a single meager meal, but she gathered it carefully, her mouth watering at the prospect of eating. As she sat down with her pitiful collection, the animals gathered around her once again. The goat looked at the apples with longing, and the rabbits' noses twitched at the scent of the grain. Eliza realized with a sinking heart that these animals were just as hungry as she was, perhaps more so. They had shared their warmth with her, possibly saving her life, and now they watched her with trusting eyes, not begging but simply present. The choice before her was clear but difficult. She could eat everything herself and ease her own suffering, or she could share and ensure they all suffered a little less together. Eliza looked at the scarred goat, the three-legged cat, the wounded deer, and made her decision. She divided the food carefully, giving each animal a portion, keeping only a small amount for herself. The apple was split and shared, the grain distributed in tiny handfuls. It wasn't enough to truly satisfy anyone, but it was something. As she chewed her small piece of apple slowly, making it last, Eliza watched the animals eat. The dog ate its portion quickly, then came and licked her hand, as if to say thank you. The cat purred against her leg. The goat nuzzled her shoulder. They understood what she had done. This act of choosing we over me, of selecting mercy over survival instinct. In that moment, human and animal were bound together by something deeper than words, a shared understanding of suffering and the choice to respond with kindness rather than cruelty. In the main house, Margaret paced before the fireplace, a goblet of wine in her hand and a cold smile on her lips. 3 days had passed since she'd locked Eliza in the barn, and she felt certain the girl would be sufficiently broken by now, or perhaps dead from the cold, which would solve her problems permanently. Constance and Beatrice had asked about their stepsister only once, and Margaret had silenced them with a sharp look. "She's exactly where she belongs," Margaret had said. "And she'll stay there until I decide otherwise." But something nagged at Margaret, a small voice of worry that the girl might survive, might somehow find a way to tell others what had happened. The townspeople had thought well of Eliza's father, and there were those who might ask questions if the girl disappeared. Margaret needed Eliza alive but thoroughly cowed, broken in spirit so completely that she would never dare speak against her stepmother. On the 4th morning, Margaret bundled herself in a warm cloak and made her way to the barn, expecting to find Eliza half-frozen and desperate to obey any command for the chance to come inside. But when she lifted the beam and pulled open the door, the sight that greeted her was not what she expected. Eliza stood in the center of the barn, surrounded by animals that Margaret recognized as the vermin that had been raiding her chicken coops and grain stores. The girl looked thinner, certainly, and her dress was dirty with hay and dust, but her eyes held no defeat. Instead, they burned with a quiet strength that made Margaret take an involuntary step backward. "You'll come inside now," Margaret commanded, trying to reassert her authority. "And you'll scrub every floor in the house on your hands and knees as penance for your transgression." But Eliza didn't move toward the door. She stood her ground, one hand resting on the dog's head, and simply stared at her stepmother with an expression that was neither defiant nor submissive, just utterly calm. Margaret's face flushed red with rage at Eliza's lack of immediate obedience. "Did you hear me, girl? I said come here at once." She stepped into the barn, reaching for Eliza's arm to drag her out as she had before. But the moment Margaret's hand extended toward Eliza, the animals moved. The dog positioned itself between them, a low growl rumbling from its chest, not loud but absolutely serious. The goat lowered its head, its one good horn pointed directly at Margaret. The three-legged cat arched its back, hissing with all the fury of a creature that had survived countless battles. Even the rabbits, those most timid of creatures, stamped their powerful hind legs in warning. The owl spread its wings and shrieked, a sound that echoed through the barn like a battle cry. Margaret stumbled backward, genuinely afraid for the first time. "What devil's work is this?" she gasped, making the sign of the cross with trembling hands. "Have you turned into a witch, speaking to beasts?" Eliza finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "They're not beasts, stepmother. They're creatures who know suffering when they see it, and they know cruelty even better. They've experienced more of it than any living thing should." The young deer limped forward to stand beside Eliza, and Margaret felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. These weren't random animals. They were a unified force, and they had clearly chosen their side. "You'll regret this impudence," Margaret hissed. backing toward the door. "You'll stay in here until you rot, do you hear me? No food, no water, nothing." But even as she made her threats, Margaret felt her power slipping away. She slammed the barn door and replaced the beam, but her hands shook as she did so. Back in the house, she stood at the window, watching the barn with troubled eyes, wondering what she had unleashed. Margaret's plans began to unravel on the 5th day when Mrs. Thornton, the baker's wife, came to the door with a basket of bread and a concerned expression. "I haven't seen young Eliza at the market in near a week," she said, peering past Margaret into the house. "She always comes by Wednesdays for the week's flour. The child isn't ill, I hope?" Margaret forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Eliza is perfectly well. She's been busy with chores. You know how farm work never ends." But Mrs. Thornton wasn't easily fooled. She'd known Eliza since the girl was born, had watched her father raise her with love and care, and she'd noticed how the child had grown thin and sad after his remarriage. "I'd like to see her, if you don't mind," Mrs. Thornton said firmly, setting down her basket. "Just to say hello." Margaret's smile froze. "That won't be possible. As I said, she's very busy," but Mrs. Thornton was already calling into the house. "Eliza? Eliza, dear, are you there?" When no answer came, and Margaret's face grew stormy, the baker's wife's suspicions solidified into certainty. "Where's that child?" she demanded. Before Margaret could formulate another lie, Constance appeared at the top of the stairs, her usual discretion abandoned in a moment of spiteful pleasure. "Mother locked her in the old barn days ago," she announced, "as punishment for pulling my hair." Mrs. Thornton's face went white, then red. "You did what?" Without waiting for permission, she pushed past Margaret and ran toward the barn, her skirts flying. Behind her, Margaret hurried after, shouting justifications that fell on deaf ears. When Mrs. Thornton lifted the beam and opened the door, she expected to find a broken, freezing child. Instead, she found Eliza sitting peacefully among a collection of animals, braiding dried grass into rope. The girl looked up, surprised, as golden afternoon light flooded into the barn, and Mrs. Thornton burst into tears at the sight. The scandal that followed Margaret's cruelty spread through the village like wildfire. Mrs. Thornton wasted no time in bringing the magistrate, the doctor, and half the village to witness what had been done to Eliza. While Margaret sputtered protests and excuses, Eliza quietly told her story, and the evidence was written plainly on her too-thin frame and the cold, barren barn. But what captured everyone's attention most was the collection of wounded animals that had become Eliza's protectors and companions. The village doctor, a kind man named Dr. Wesley, examined both Eliza and the animals with gentle hands. "This girl would have died of exposure or starvation," he declared, looking at Margaret with disgust. "That she survived is a miracle. Or rather, it's thanks to these poor creatures who chose mercy over their own survival." The magistrate was clear in his judgment. Margaret was stripped of guardianship and ordered to provide Eliza with her inheritance from her father, money and property that Margaret had been hoarding for her own daughters. Mrs. Thornton and her husband offered Eliza a home, and the girl accepted gratefully, but on one condition: the animals must come too. A portion of Eliza's inheritance was used to transform the old barn into a proper sanctuary, with warm stalls, good food, and medical care for each creature. Eliza worked alongside the village veterinarian to heal what could be healed and provide comfort where healing wasn't possible. The three-legged cat learned to navigate with grace. The dog's coat grew shiny and thick. The goat's wounds faded to scars that told a story of survival. Word spread of the girl who had been saved by animals, and soon people began bringing her other creatures in need: injured birds, abandoned kittens, mistreated horses. Eliza welcomed them all, never forgetting the lesson she'd learned in that cold barn, that mercy is a choice, and choosing kindness in the face of cruelty is the most powerful magic in the world. Years later, Eliza would sit in her sanctuary, surrounded by creatures who had every reason to hate humanity but had chosen love instead, and she would remember that dark barn not as a place of punishment, but as the place where she learned what truly mattered. Margaret had tried to break her with cruelty, But the animals had responded with mercy, and in doing so, they had saved not just Eliza's life but her soul. The barn became a beacon of hope, proving that even in the darkest moments, compassion could light the way forward, and that sometimes the most human thing we can do is learn from those we once thought were lesser than ourselves.